On the morning of October 24, 1877, the Old Bailey courtroom in London was packed to absolute capacity. The air inside the stone hall was thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and coal smoke. Hundreds of spectators, members of Parliament, high society aristocrats, journalists from across Europe, and everyday London citizens, shoved past one another to catch a glimpse of the prisoner's dock. They had not gathered to witness the trial of a notorious street thief, a violent gang leader, or a desperate back-alley murderer. Instead, the four men standing behind the iron railing were the most powerful law enforcement officers in the British Empire. These were the legendary senior detectives of Great Scotland Yard. They were the elite investigators trusted to protect the largest city on earth, men whose faces were regularly printed in newspapers as national heroes. But on this cold October morning, they were not the hunters. They were the accused. For months, a terrifying rumor had circulated through the streets of London, and now it was laid bare before a grand jury. The elite detective branch of the Metropolitan Police had not been fighting crime. They had spent years operating as the hidden, protected muscle for an international syndicate of swindlers. Across from them sat the Crown's prosecutors, their desks piled high with an overwhelming mountain of physical evidence. There were hundreds of coded telegrams intercepted from government wires. There were secret ledgers containing lists of transactions written in cipher. There were piles of pristine, stolen Bank of England banknotes recovered from floorboards, and expensive gold pocket watches engraved with the initials of career criminals. The entire foundation of British justice, a system that proudly marketed itself to the world as the most civilized and uncorruptible on earth, was on trial for its very life. For a global audience watching this history unfold from the vantage point of the 21st century, it is difficult to overstate the absolute shockwave this trial sent through Victorian society. To the public of 1877, Scotland Yard was not just a police force. It was a symbol of British imperial superiority, scientific progress, and absolute moral order. If the men at the very top of Scotland Yard could be bought, then every conviction they had ever secured was suspect. Every law they swore to uphold was a lie. The public was left staring into a terrifying vacuum. When the detectives themselves are the criminals, who is left to protect the citizens? But how did the world's most celebrated police department become completely controlled by an underground gambling ring? The answer did not lie in violence or physical intimidation. It lay in a highly sophisticated, mathematically calculated psychological game played by two of the most fascinating con artists in criminal history. They had realized that the greatest vulnerability in the British legal system was not a physical flaw in a prison wall or a lack of men on patrol. The flaw was the human ego, the desperate financial strain of the men in uniform, and the complete lack of oversight within a secretive government department. I end this comprehensive documentary chronicle from EnterTheCrime. We will strip away the myths and examine the raw historical evidence of the turf fraud scandal of 1877, an event historically prosecuted as the trial of the detectives. This is an expansive look not just at a massive financial theft, but at a complete institutional decay that forced the total death and rebirth of modern police investigation. As we dissect the archives, we must confront two deeply unsettling questions. First, how did a pair of confidence men manage to systematically manipulate, pay off, and direct the senior staff of Scotland Yard for years without a single alarm being raised by internal leadership? And second, when an entire system is structurally designed to facilitate corruption, can individual morality ever survive? If you are interested in deep, globally focused true crime documentaries told through a calm, immersive, and highly analytical lens, please take a moment to subscribe to EnterTheCrime and turn on notifications. We explore the darkest chapters of human history without sensationalism, focusing entirely on the psychological truths and social realities behind the headlines. To understand how England's highest-ranking police officials ended up facing decades of hard labor alongside the very men they were supposed to imprison, we must step entirely out of the crowded, tense courtroom of the Old Bailey. We have to go back to the beginning. We must travel across the English Channel to a world of immense wealth, luxury, and profound isolation, where a new breed of criminal was waiting to exploit a deeply vulnerable society. To comprehend the sheer scale of the turf fraud scandal, we must first understand the social landscape of the 1870s. This was an era of unprecedented global transformation. The Industrial Revolution had created a massive explosion of new wealth across Western Europe. For the first time in history, millions of pounds, francs, and marks were moving across borders at the speed of steamships and international railway networks. Yet, the institutions designed to police this wealth were still trapped in the past. For our global audience, it is vital to visualize how the British legal and policing systems operated at this specific moment in time. The Metropolitan Police of London was relatively young, having been established in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel. The vast majority of this force consisted of uniformed patrolmen, known colloquially as bubbies. These men were highly visible on the streets. Their primary role was strictly preventative. They walked designated beats, checked door locks, deterred street robberies, and maintained public order through a constant physical presence. However, hidden deep within the headquarters of Scotland Yard was a tiny, highly insular, and secretive group known as the Detective Branch. Formed in 1842, this unit was entirely different from the uniformed police. They did not wear blue uniforms or tall hats. They wore civilian suits. They did not walk beats. Their job was to blend into the shadows of London's high society clubs, taverns, and financial districts to solve complex crimes after they had occurred. Because their work required absolute secrecy, these detectives operated with almost no daily supervision from the police commissioner. They kept their own notes, worked with confidential informants, and were given total autonomy to manage their investigations. They were poorly paid compared to the enormous amounts of capital flowing through London, yet they held immense, unchecked authority. This created a highly unstable systemic environment, a structural vulnerability that was waiting for the right predators to exploit it. Those predators were William Kurr and Harry Benson. To understand the psychology of this fraud, we must analyze these two men, who possessed completely opposite but perfectly complementary personalities. William Kurr was a product of the London streets. He was a native-born Londoner, deeply embedded from a young age in the city's working-class subculture of horse racing, illicit street betting, and underground bookmaking. Kurr was not an educated man in the traditional sense, but he possessed an extraordinary level of street intelligence, organizational capability, and operational discipline. He knew exactly how the lower-level police officers thought, he knew their financial struggles, and he understood how to approach a man in uniform without raising suspicion. Kurr was the logistical engine of the operation. If William Kurr was the engine, Harry Benson was the architect. Benson possessed a highly sophisticated, upper-class psychological profile that made him uniquely dangerous. Born into a wealthy, respectable family, Benson had been highly educated across Europe. He was completely fluent in French, German, and Italian, and he possessed the flawless manners, diction, and style of a high-born aristocrat. He was a psychological chameleon who could effortlessly enter a luxury hotel, a private bank, or a high-society salon and convince everyone in the room that he was a wealthy international businessman or foreign nobleman. But beneath this immaculate, charming exterior lay a deeply calculated compulsion for high-stakes fraud. Benson did not steal out of necessity. He stole because he derived an intense psychological thrill from outsmarting the structures of society. He had already spent time in an English prison for a complex forgery scheme involving a fictitious charity, an experience that did not reform him, but instead taught him exactly how the prison system and the police function from the inside. In the summer of 1876, this powerful criminal partnership turned its attention toward France, seeking a victim who possessed immense wealth but was completely removed from the daily realities of British commerce. They found the perfect target in Countess Marie de Goncourt. Madame de Goncourt was an elderly, deeply respectable widow living a quiet life of luxury. In the social context of 19th-century France, wealthy aristocratic women were often highly isolated from the mechanics of international finance and industrial business. They relied completely on correspondence, trusted family lawyers, and the absolute honesty of banking institutions. Madame de Goncourt was a deeply religious, trusting woman who wished to quietly grow her substantial family fortune so she could leave a legacy for her children and her preferred charities. To Kurr and Benson, her massive wealth, her complete lack of familiarity with the English language, and her innocence regarding the predatory nature of sports betting made her the ultimate target. But a fraud of this magnitude required a shield. Kurr and Benson could not operate in a vacuum. They knew that the moment they began moving large sums of money, Scotland Yard would eventually receive complaints. To prevent this, Kurr had spent years quietly building a deeply compromised relationship with a rising star in the Metropolitan Police, Inspector John Michaeljan. Michaeljan was an exceptionally talented, hard-working detective who had risen through the ranks due to his ability to solve street crimes. But like many detectives of his era, Michaeljan was trapped in a cycle of personal debt, struggling to maintain a respectable middle-class lifestyle on a meager government wage. Years earlier, William Kurr had approached Michaeljan, not with an outright demand for illegal acts, but with small, seemingly innocent gifts of cash to help the inspector pay his rent. In exchange, Kurr asked for simple favors: advance notice of police raids on illegal street betting dens so that Kurr's operations could move locations before the uniform officers arrived. For years, this relationship remained completely invisible to police leadership. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police believed that Inspector Michaeljan was simply an extraordinarily well-informed officer who possessed an unmatched network of underworld informants. In reality, the lines between law enforcement and organized crime had already completely collapsed. Michaeljan had become addicted to the steady stream of criminal gold. He was no longer a detective who utilized informants. He had become an informant for the criminals. Something here was fundamentally, structurally wrong. The very apparatus built by the British state to protect the public from exploitation was already rotting from within, quietly waiting for a massive catalyst to expose the decay to the entire world. That catalyst arrived on a specific morning in August 1876, when a beautifully addressed, expensive envelope from London was carried up the steps of Madame de Goncourt's estate. When Madame de Goncourt opened the package delivered to her chateau in August 1876, she discovered a copy of a highly sophisticated French-language sports periodical. The newspaper, titled Le Sport, was a masterpiece of graphic design and editorial execution. It contained highly detailed, beautifully written analytical columns tracking European horse racing trends, statistical charts of past winners, and elegant advertisements for luxury British carriage makers and equestrian equipment. But Le Sport was an absolute illusion. Every single word, column, layout choice, and advertisement had been written, compiled, and printed in a hidden print shop in the heart of London by Harry Benson and William Kurr. It was a newspaper created for an audience of exactly one person. The centerpiece of this fraudulent newspaper was a series of glowing articles profiling a legendary British sports bettor named Mr. Hugh Montgomery. The articles claimed that Montgomery was a mathematical genius who had spent decades analyzing the bloodlines, track conditions, and biomechanics of English racehorses. According to Le Sport, Montgomery had developed a secret, completely infallible formula for predicting the winner of any horse race with absolute certainty. The articles went on to explain that Montgomery's system was so incredibly successful that the major bookmaking houses of Great Britain had suffered millions of pounds in losses, leading them to issue a lifetime ban preventing Montgomery from placing any wagers in his own name. The newspaper presented the reader with an extraordinary, seemingly exclusive financial opportunity. It stated that because Mr. Montgomery was legally banned from betting in England, he was urgently searching for wealthy, highly respectable foreign citizens to act as his international proxies. The mechanics of the offer were designed to sound completely risk-free. Montgomery would use his secret formula to identify a winning horse, and he would send the foreign investor his own money via bank check to place the wager on his behalf. The investor would keep a massive 10% commission on all winnings simply for processing the transaction through their continental bank accounts. Madame de Goncourt found the proposition completely logical. She responded to the London postal address listed in the newspaper. Within days, she received a polite, deeply deferential letter written in immaculate, high society French by Harry Benson, who was fully embodying the fictional persona of the aristocratic sports tycoon Hugh Montgomery. The mechanics of the swindle were executed with the precision of a high-level bank heist. Benson mailed Madame de Goncourt a series of large checks totaling thousands of pounds, drawn on an institution prominently labelled the Bank of London. He instructed her to deposit these checks into her personal account in France, and then use her own immediate liquid funds to wire corresponding wagers to a designated high society English bookmaker named Captain Hadley. In reality, Captain Hadley was nothing more than William Kurr operating out of a rented room filled with fake ledgers. The Bank of London checks sent to Madame de Goncourt were completely worthless pieces of beautifully engraved paper. But because international banking in 1876 relied entirely on physical paper documents carried across the ocean on steamships and verified by horse-drawn mail couriers, Benson and Kurr knew it would take several weeks for the French banks to realize the checks were complete forgeries. Believing she was fully protected by the massive English checks sitting in her vault, Madame de Goncourt drew heavily upon her own real, liquid capital. Over the course of less than 30 days, she sent a staggering total of £10,120 across the English Channel directly into the bank accounts controlled by Kurr and Benson. In the economics of the late 19th century, this was an absolute king's ransom, equivalent to well over $1.5 million today. Benson and Kurr had achieved the pinnacle of criminal success. They had extracted a massive fortune from an aristocratic victim without ever using a weapon, breaking a lock, or uttering a physical threat. They had operated entirely through the mail, exploiting the slow physical speeds of international communication and the psychological vulnerabilities of an isolated, trusting widow. But in late September 1876, the criminal window abruptly collapsed. Madame de Goncourt's private banker in Paris finally received a formal clearance notice from the Financial Clearinghouse in London. The message was devastating. The Bank of London was a complete fiction. It had no gold reserves, no offices, and no legal existence. The checks held by the countess were completely worthless. The £10,000 of real family wealth she had wired to England had vanished into the London underworld. The emotional toll on Madame de Goncourt was profound. She was not just financially damaged, she was deeply humiliated, cast into a state of severe shock by the realization that her intelligence and trust had been completely turned against her by professional predators. Her family immediately acted. They bypassed standard channels and retained a highly aggressive, brilliant young London solicitor named Mr. William Abrahams. Abrahams was handed absolute power to travel to London, present the physical proof of the fraud to the highest authorities, and ensure the immediate arrest of the scammers. When Mr. Abrahams walked up the stone steps of Great Scotland Yard holding the forged letters, the fake newspapers, and the bank routing numbers, the case appeared to be an open and shut investigation. The police had the exact names of the accounts, the physical locations where the mail was delivered, and descriptions of the men involved. Benson and Kurr should have been behind bars within 48 hours. But as soon as the senior detectives walked into the room to take the case, nothing about the investigation made sense. Every single time the solicitor and local officers organized a raid on a suspect's hiding place, they arrived to find the coffee still warm on the table, the documents burned in the fireplace, and the suspects completely gone. The initial theory formulated by the junior officers at Scotland Yard was that Benson and Kurr were simply possessed of an extraordinary, almost supernatural level of criminal luck. They assumed the con artists had hired an elite network of street lookouts who stood watch outside every train station and hotel lobby in the country. But the reality uncovered by historical archives was infinitely more terrifying for the British establishment. When Mr. Abrahams presented his ironclad evidence of international fraud, the executive leadership of Scotland Yard did not hand the case to ordinary street patrolmen. They turned the files over to the absolute peak of their elite detective branch. The case was assigned directly to Chief Inspector Nathaniel Druskovich, Chief Inspector William Palmer, and the legendary, highly decorated Chief Inspector George Clark. These were the crown jewels of British law enforcement, men celebrated globally for solving the most complex puzzles in criminal history. What the solicitor did not know, and what the Commissioner of Police completely failed to see, was that the moment the files landed on Chief Inspector Druskovich's desk, a secret machinery was set into motion. Inspector John Michaeljan, the detective already deep in William Kurr's pocket, convened an urgent, late-night meeting with his senior colleagues. Within 48 hours, Kurr and Benson had utilized their massive reserves of stolen French cash to expand their bribery network to the very top of the department. They began paying massive, recurring cash bribes directly to Chief Inspectors Druskovich and Palmer. Consider the absolute magnitude of this structural collapse. The very detectives legally mandated by the British Crown to hunt down international fugitives had effectively become their business partners, operating as an early warning defense network for a criminal syndicate. The entire investigation quickly degenerated into an elaborate piece of choreographed theater. In October 1876, Mr. Abrahams discovered through private informants that Harry Benson was hiding under a false name at a luxury resort hotel in the remote, beautiful town of Bridge of Allan, located in the mountains of Scotland. Abrahams immediately brought this information to Chief Inspector Druskovich, demanding that an arrest warrant be executed. Druskovich calmly took the details, smiled, and assured the solicitor that justice would be served swiftly. He filled out the legal paperwork and prepared to board the northbound train. Detectives thought they had their man. They didn't. Before boarding the train to Scotland with his team, Chief Inspector Druskovich walked into a private telegraph office completely away from Scotland Yard. Utilizing a pre-arranged cipher code, he sent an urgent, encrypted telegram directly to William Kurr's secret London address. The message contained the exact departure time of the police train, the names of the officers, and the precise hour they would arrive in Scotland. By the time Druskovich and the local Scottish police marched into the luxury hotel with their handcuffs drawn, Harry Benson had already checked out of his room, packed his expensive luggage, paid his bill, and boarded a southbound train on a parallel track, passing his pursuers in the dark. At this point in our documentary investigation, let us pause and look directly at the evidence as it existed in late 1876. If you were a citizen of London, or an independent journalist reading the daily news updates during this period, what would you conclude? Would you believe that the criminals were simply untouchable geniuses who could read minds, or would you begin to see that the failure was so consistent, so systemic, that it could only be directed from the inside? Public outrage began to reach a fever pitch. The British press, led by investigative journalists, began publishing highly critical, mocking editorials targeting Scotland Yard's apparent incompetence. The papers pointed out that two highly visible men, known to be carrying thousands of pounds in stolen capital, were easily moving through train stations, banks, and hotels without ever being caught. The political pressure on the Home Office, the government department responsible for national security, became completely unbearable. The evidence seemed completely conclusive that the swindlers had won. They successfully fled the British Isles entirely, crossing the North Sea to hide in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. But their escape led directly to a narrative reversal that no one, least of all the corrupt detectives, saw coming. Benson and Kurr needed to convert their stolen wealth into usable international currency. They held a large fortune in high-denomination Bank of England banknotes that had been drawn from Madame de Goncourt's accounts. What the con artists did not anticipate was the ruthless efficiency of the international banking network when its own survival was threatened. The Bank of England had quietly distributed a comprehensive list of the exact serial numbers of every single banknote associated with the turf fraud to every major financial institution across Western Europe. In late November 1876, Harry Benson walked into a prominent bank in Rotterdam, handed the teller a large English note, and asked for Dutch currency. The teller quietly looked down at the blacklist beneath his counter, matched the serial numbers exactly, and signaled the armed Rotterdam police waiting in the hall. Within minutes, both Benson and Kurr were surrounded, disarmed, and thrown into a cold Dutch prison cell awaiting formal extradition hearings. The confession sounded ironclad, until someone replayed the tape of the investigation with absolute precision. Sitting in that dark Rotterdam cell, facing the prospect of 20 years of brutal physical labor in an English penal colony, Harry Benson's sophisticated psychological facade completely broke. He looked across the cell at William Kurr and realized that the thousands of pounds they had paid to Chief Inspectors Druskovich, Palmer, and Michaeljan had bought them absolutely nothing in the end. He felt a profound sense of narcissistic betrayal. Benson quietly summoned the British prosecutor who had traveled to the Netherlands to oversee the extradition. He reached into his tailored coat, pulled out a highly detailed personal diary, and produced a collection of confidential letters written on official Scotland Yard stationery. He laid them out on the wooden prison table. Benson did not ask for forgiveness, he demanded a transaction. He stated that he possessed absolute, unassailable physical proof that the most celebrated detectives in the British Empire were his active criminal accomplices. And now, the entire stability of the Victorian legal system would be decided in a single room. To truly understand why the turf fraud scandal occurred, we must look entirely past the physical mechanics of the forged newspapers, the bank routing numbers, and the intercepted telegrams. We must dissect the complex psychology of the men involved and the unique, hidden systemic pressures that drove them to make choices that destroyed their lives. Let us first analyze the perpetrator mindset based strictly on documented historical behavior, court testimonies, and contemporary expert analysis. Harry Benson was an individual who did not operate out of a standard need for material survival. He was driven by a deep, narcissistic psychological compulsion to dominate institutions. To Benson, the entire structure of Victorian society, with its rigid class rules, its complex laws, and its prideful banks, was nothing more than a stage design meant to be manipulated. He derived an immense sense of personal identity and superiority from knowing that he could sit in a room with aristocrats or police chiefs and completely control their actions through deception. Even when he was trapped in a prison cell, his core psychological survival mechanism was not remorse, but manipulation. He did not turn on the senior detectives out of a moral awakening or a desire to cleanse the legal system. He did it as a highly calculated, transactional play to reduce his own physical suffering, turning his former protectors into his ultimate currency. William Kurr, by contrast, possessed a highly pragmatic, deeply cynical, and transactional psychology. Raised in the brutal economic environment of the London working class, Kurr viewed the law not as a sacred moral truth, but as a luxury reserved exclusively for the wealthy. He did not view bribery as a horrific moral crime. He viewed it as a standard, logical cost of doing business in a city dominated by capital. He knew that every man had a price, and he realized that the senior detectives of Scotland Yard were uniquely vulnerable to temptation due to a profound structural contradiction in their social status. This brings us to a critical reframing insight that completely changes how we must view this entire historical narrative. It is incredibly easy to look back at Chief Inspectors Druskovich, Palmer, and Michaeljan and dismiss them simply as uniquely evil, greedy, or fundamentally corrupt men. But the documented historical evidence reveals a far more complex and tragic reality regarding institutional pressure. In 1877, the senior detectives of Scotland Yard occupied a highly anomalous social position. They were expected by the state to dress in expensive, high-society civilian clothing, to dine at luxury clubs, to mingle with millionaires, and to solve highly complex international financial crimes. Yet, the Metropolitan Police paid these men a tiny, working-class wage that barely allowed them to pay rent and buy basic food for their families in an increasingly expensive metropolis. They were surrounded by an ocean of immense wealth every single day, tasked with protecting it, yet completely barred from achieving it legally. Chief Inspector Nathaniel Druskovich, for example, was under an absolute mountain of personal and psychological strain. His immediate family was suffering from severe illness, and in a desperate bid to maintain his middle-class respectability, he had fallen deep into debt with predatory street moneylenders who threatened to ruin his career. When William Kurr walked into his life and offered him a single, clean cash payment that exceeded his entire annual government salary simply for delaying a piece of paper, Druskovich experienced a profound psychological collapse. He did not set out to become a criminal mastermind. He chose the immediate survival of his family over an abstract oath to an empire that underpaid him. The media narrative of the era heavily intensified these psychological pressures. The Victorian press had spent decades building an illusion for the public, telling them that Scotland Yard was an impenetrable, scientific wall that stood between civilization and the criminal chaos of the streets. When the headlines broke revealing that the wall itself was completely rotten, it generated a profound crisis of public faith. The public did not just see a story about a stolen fortune across the channel, they saw a terrifying breakdown of the social contract. If the police could be purchased by the highest bidder, then the law was no longer a shield for the citizen, it was a weapon used by the wealthy criminal against the innocent. And all of this immense psychological, social, and political weight came to a definitive head when the final jury verdict was prepared at the Old Bailey. The trial of the detectives concluded in November 1877 after weeks of grueling testimony that completely transfixed the international public. It remains, to this day, one of the longest, most sensational, and most damaging trials in the long history of British jurisprudence. Harry Benson and William Kurr took the witness stand, not as defendants facing judgment, but as the star witnesses for the prosecution. With completely cold, clinical precision, they detailed every single secret meeting, every cash transfer in dark alleys, and every warning telegram sent from official offices. The jury deliberated for hours in complete isolation as the crowds waited outside in the freezing rain. When they returned, the verdicts they delivered struck a lethal blow to the old structure of Scotland Yard. Inspector John Michaeljan, Chief Inspector Nathaniel Druskovich, and Chief Inspector William Palmer were found completely guilty of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. The judge looked down at the men who had once been the pride of the nation and delivered a scathing lecture on the betrayal of public trust. He sentenced each of them to 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. In the 19th century, hard labor was a brutal, physical sentence designed to break a prisoner's health through mindless, repetitive tasks like turning a heavy iron crank or breaking stones in complete silence. Chief Inspector George Clark, the elderly leader of the unit, was formally acquitted by the jury due to a lack of direct financial transactions linking him to the payoff money. However, his professional credibility was completely destroyed by the revelation of his proximity to the corruption, and he walked out of the courtroom only to tender his resignation from the police force in absolute disgrace the very next morning. Harry Benson and William Kurr were led away to serve long, harsh sentences of penal servitude for their original multi-thousand-pound fraud against Madame de Goncourt. The long-term institutional consequences of this scandal completely altered the course of modern history. The British government and the public realized that a small, highly secretive, and completely unsupervised detective force was fundamentally dangerous to a democratic society. In April 1878, just months after the prisoners were marched off to jail, the old detective branch of Scotland Yard was completely dissolved and wiped from the books. In its place, they constructed an entirely new, modern institution that remains famous to this day, the Criminal Investigation Department, known globally as the CID. The Home Office appointed a brilliant, highly disciplined young legal mind named Howard Vincent to take total control of the new department. Vincent completely restructured how detective work was executed. He eliminated the absolute autonomy that had allowed the old inspectors to hide their crimes. He instituted rigid daily record-keeping, mandatory centralized case diaries, and implemented a strict chain of command where every detective's notes were reviewed by independent supervisors every single morning. Most importantly, Vincent addressed the structural economic vulnerability that had started the decay. He secured massive government funding to significantly raise the salaries of all investigative officers, ensuring that a detective could maintain a respectable life without ever having to look toward the criminal underworld for financial survival. He built the professionalized, scientific, and systematic infrastructure that allowed Scotland Yard to regain public faith and become the world's most respected investigative body in the 20th century. Countess Marie de Goncourt never managed to recover the vast majority of her stolen family fortune. The gold had been spent, moved through European banks, or consumed by the corrupt detectives long before the arrests were made. But her courageous decision to hire an independent solicitor and fight through a foreign legal system exposed a deep, hidden disease that was quietly eating away at the core of British law enforcement. The turf fraud scandal of 1877 demonstrates with absolute clarity that the greatest threat to a society's safety is rarely the criminal operating in the shadows of the street. The greatest threat occurs when the individuals trusted to hold the light choose to walk in the dark, turning the power of the state against the very citizens they swore to protect. In the end, this extraordinary case doesn't just ask us who was guilty on that cold October morning. It asks a far deeper, universal question that every modern society must continue to confront. When the machinery of justice becomes compromised by wealth, ego, and systemic neglect, do we possess the courage to completely tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up? If you are interested in deep, globally focused true crime documentaries told through a calm, immersive, and highly analytical lens, please take a moment to subscribe to EnterTheCrime and turn on notifications. We explore the darkest chapters of human history without sensationalism, focusing entirely on the psychological truths and social realities behind the headlines.